I got to tell you, there's times where I prepare for Marketplace Bible Study, and if you've ever been a teacher or a presenter, you know this is true. There's times that I prepare, and what I prepare I think is relevant for you. Not sure it's relevant for me. And that's not a bad thing. It's just I teach so often and so much that I believe everything I say. I wouldn't say it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it always applies to me or that I feel it the same as other times. But that is not the case today. As I was preparing last night up until about 10 o'clock, it just hit me. I felt like the Lord was just slapping me and saying that everything I'm going to say this morning applies back to me in a very, very significant way. And you'll see why as we go along. So let me set it up this way. You and I live in a very fast-paced, consumer-oriented, instant expecting society where I think one of the most hated words today is the word wait. I mean, what at least 50 years ago was a neutral word, if not even positive, now is a word in which just about everybody that I know has a disdain for the word wait. And the reason I know this is because I could give you multiple scenarios where you think of this word and it's not positive. So you're going through a construction zone, and all of a sudden all the cars are moving and it gets to your car, and because of the organizational abilities of the kid with the sign, he turns it to stop right when you are there, and you have to wait, and you're not feeling very good. Or you call Payway. There's a Payway near my house, and I call Payway, and invariably they're always busy at dinner time, which is a good sign for a restaurant like that. And they'll say, you reached Payway, can you wait? When they put me on hold. I don't like that. And then you're in your favorite restaurant, and the waiter, I don't know why they call him a waiter, the waiter comes over and tells you that the meal that you have ordered is going to take a little bit longer, and you're not feeling positive yet. I mean, I want you guys to think of all the times in your daily world where the word wait comes your way, and ask yourself, are any of them your friend? Any of them? You wait in line at the DMV. You wait for a late friend at the restaurant. You wait for an overdue package from UPS. You wait in the express line at the grocery store. Isn't that one fun? You have to wait up to the left and off to the side when your fast food restaurant order isn't ready. You have to wait for 60 seconds during commercials with your favorite television show. I mean, think about it, guys. All of us have to wait in our lives, and none of us enjoy it, at least as far as what I observe among people. And to be fair, there is the odd waiting that we might have at least a neutral or maybe a positive experience with, like a Christmas gift or for a friend who's arriving at the airport. Maybe that'll sum up a semi-positive image. But most of us do not think very kindly of the word wait, and certainly not the highlight of our week. Now, as if that were not enough, there's an additional problem with this idea of waiting, and that's that its antonym is something that we love, and its antonym is go. And so think of all the uses of the word go. Get up and go. Go right ahead. Oh, go on. I better get going. I'm going on vacation. I'm going to the fridge to see what's in there. Think about all the things that you do on a daily basis, and that word go is your friend. The word wait is not a friend. For most people, they love go and they hate wait. So why is this important this morning? As Dave mentioned, we are in the book of Esther, a young Jewish woman in the Old Testament. And this is a wonderful book that's teaching us a lot about our relationship with God, even though it's about a young woman, and this is a men's Bible study. And tucked away right in the middle of this book, we're about halfway through right now, is a story that we started unpacking last week. And though I'm going to note what we talked about last week here in a minute, I got to tell you, the second part of this lesson is going to have everything to do with a subject that has fallen on hard times in our modern times, and that's the subject of weight. Because what God is going to come along and do this morning, now get this, is that in the usual way that God does, he's going to turn this idea of waiting upside down. He's going to redeem this word. He's going to baptize it with grace and truth and tell us that not only is waiting a good thing, but get this, men, it's an absolutely indispensable thing, especially for anybody that wants to have a real and vital relationship with God. Isn't that interesting? Put it this way. If Christians somehow don't become friends with the word wait, then the reality is we will never be satisfied people when it comes to God. That's what God makes so clear in his word. So let's talk about what that means. If you were here last week, I taught you a new little phrase that has everything to do with Esther's journey when it comes to following and knowing God. It's a phrase that I borrowed from Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, who borrowed it from one of his lifetime mentors. So this is a phrase that, like a broken baton, has been passed on and on and on and on. And it's the phrase God room. God room. And so let's refresh ourselves on where we are with this whole idea of Esther's story in God room. It's 500 BC in Israel, and Israel is in exile, having been overrun and taken captive by the Persians at that time, a nation to the north and to the east. The temple is gone, the priests are mostly dead and scattered, the leadership of the nation is broken, and most of the people have been taken to Susa, the capital of Persia, and the home that they love is no more, and God as they knew him, this is key, is very much distant and behind the scenes. So just like some of us experience in our own walk with God in our own lives, where we sense God is very far off and distant, that's the book of Esther. And I think that's why it's such a relevant book. God is not mentioned in this book at all. Things like prayer and the temple and the law are rarely mentioned at all in the book of Esther. I mean, if you didn't know this book was in the Bible, it would not read at all like a religious book. And that's by design, because God is very much behind the scenes in the book of Esther. But as we all know, a light starts to break through. A woman named Esther catches the king's eye, and she's a young, humble Jewish woman, and he decides to make her the queen. He's not a shining example of godliness at all. I mean, it's a spiritually single marriage if there ever was one, but she has lots of hope for her nation and for her people. But just as light begins to shine, the clouds hide the sun again as Esther's cousin, a guy named Mordecai, refuses to break the first commandment and bow to the king's second in command, a guy by the name of Haman. And Haman, as you guys know, gets so mad that he hatches a plot to exterminate all of the Jews in Persia. And the historical records cite outside the Bible that there was over 1 million Jews living in Persia at that time. And so now it all falls on Esther. She has to get her husband, the king, to try to stop this crazy plan of Haman's. And to do this, as you guys might remember, Esther has to get an audience with the king without offending him, which was hard to do back then, even for the wife. And then she has to get him to hear her and to be convinced to have mercy on this foreign group of people that, quite frankly, he didn't care about anyway, who are living in his land. And so to do this, Esther hatches her own plan. As we called the session last week and continued it today, I see it as a well-laid plan. Esther hatches a well-laid plan. And as we saw last week, it's kind of a zany plan. She gets her audience with the king, but instead of simply asking her request, that, by the way, stood a really good chance of succeeding, she stalls a bit. You guys remember this? She stalls and says to the king, after she gets an audience with him, well, here's my request. I want you to come to dinner tonight. She's inviting her husband to dinner. And so he says, well, yeah, I mean, I'd give you remember this? I'd give you up to half the United States. I'll give you half of my kingdom because you're my wife. And so then at dinner, instead of then asking for the king's help, which again seems like a good time to do it, she stalls some more and invites the king to another dinner the next night. And you go, well, what's that about? And then and only then does Esther reveal to the king that she herself is Jewish, and so is Mordecai, and that he needs to put a stop to this crazy plan of his second in command to kill all the Jews living in Persia. And the question I asked you guys to wrestle with last week, and this will lead us right now up to our study this week, is why did Esther do this? I mean, why this staggered, stalling plan of hers? Why didn't she just ask the king when he first said to her a day and a half before, I'll give you up to half my kingdom, anything you want? Why did she do that? And the answer, though simple, I believe is profound, and this is what we looked at last week, and that's that Esther was leaving a lot of intentional room for God to enter into her plans and orchestrate events that only he could do. I mean, she knew that the king would probably say yes, but she wanted God to have plenty of room in her circumstances to do even more. Remember Ephesians chapter 3, that he wants to do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine? I don't know if that's in Ephesians. It's somewhere in the New Testament. To do even more than what she was thinking. Please see, men, by having a plan that slowed down at key points and paused and didn't go further with human effort, Esther left lots of God room in her plans for God to show up. And as we know, this happened. Between the first and second dinner of Esther's plan, about a 12 to 24-hour period, multiple things happened that I showed you last week that could only be chalked up to God. God working in and through the main players of Haman and Mordecai and the king and others. And it totally softened the king, because now he was really impressed with Mordecai to give Esther what she was after. It's called God room, leaving lots of room for God in our plans. It's where our human striving stops and where God's activity can begin. And I ended last week by simply noting that it's something that you and I need a lot more of in our lives, right? We do, at least I do. Even as a pastor, I'm fairly self-sufficient. I'm seminary trained. I've been leading for 25 years. I know how to run a church. It's about the only thing I know how to do, but I know how to do that. And so there's many days where I wake up, and if I wanted to, I could hit the autopilot button like you guys do with your businesses and say, I'm okay. And do my little daily quiet time, say a few prayers, be nice to people all day, and who would be the wiser? God would. And so God has got me in a headlock many times saying, where is your dependency? Is it on me, or is it just on all the things that maybe I've blessed you with? Now, here's the catch with God room, and this is what we need to address today. It's a wonderful concept. It's a wonderful subject, and it's a lot easier said than done. One of the things we've been studying at our church for the last couple of weeks is this internal battle inside every Christian between what we call the flesh, your bodily passions, and that fallen part of your nature, between the flesh and the Holy Spirit who lives inside every believer. And we've been noting at our church that there is a literal war going on inside the soul of every follower of Jesus Christ. The world has a war too, but as I've noted, it's a war between what I would finally call the flesh and the flesh. If somebody doesn't know Christ, they're battling their own flesh at any given moment. Romans 2 talks about the fact that we all have consciences, and our consciences either excuse us or not excuse us. So, even the most decadent person in Hollywood, let's call him Howard Stern, is battling, he's in New York actually, but battling, the flesh versus the flesh. The reality is, however, you and I have a heightened battle that makes things like God room really hard to live out. So the question I want us to wrestle with today is how? How do you and I go about carving out more God room in our lives, carving out God room every day of the week so that we might see God show up? And as my mentor, I was mentored by a German Baptist preacher for years on end, Lud Goltz. We called him Lud. His full name was Ludwig Reinhold Goltz. And he mentored me all during my early days of Christianity. And he used to call these things God sightings. He'd say, have you had any God sightings lately where you're seeing God show up? He almost sounded like a charismatic, but he was Baptist. So I guess even Baptists believe in God sightings. And it was really profound where he would challenge me to see that in my life. And this is where when you guys, I go to Apply God Room, this is where that word that we don't like comes into play. Now, I want to marry two concepts with you right now. I want to marry the concept of God Room that we all want more of and need more of with this idea of waiting. Because here's the key. The key to God Room is learning to wait on God. How do you develop God Room? What's his recipe for carving out space for him to show up? You have to learn to wait on him. And this is why I said earlier, if you do not make friends with this term wait when it comes to God, you will not develop God Room in your life, and therefore you will miss out on a significant amount of God in your life. You might still be saved. As 1 Corinthians 3 said, you might be one who narrowly escapes the flames, but the reality is that you and I want better. We want more for our lives and walk with God. And let's face it, most of us don't like waiting on the little things in life, let alone waiting on the big things in life. Because you see, at best, for us, waiting on, how many of you have ever addressed this subject of waiting on God, not waiting in line at the grocery? How many of you ever even broached the subject of what it means to wait on God? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, yeah, I guess that. Maybe about half of us. You guys are kind of the veteran believers of our community. You guys have been going to Schrader's Bible study for years and other ones. And so my guess is you have at least heard of this topic. Here's what happens after Christians have been exposed to this idea of waiting on God. And this is going to depress some of you, but it's really true. I find that even Christians that are familiar with this idea of waiting on God see it at best as a drag, as a drudgery, as something to endure and something to persevere through. Honestly, I've read entire books on waiting on God. The classic is Andrew Murray's Waiting on God. And it was music to my soul years ago. And as I've interacted with other people on that subject of waiting on God, they're like, oh, what a drag. I guess you have to do it. Kind of like eating broccoli at dinner. It's like, okay, I'll do it, but I'm only doing it because I think it has a good purpose in the end. I'm not doing it because there's any intrinsic joy. So let me give you a great example of how I see most people wait on God. As some of you guys know, my wife is a school teacher. She's been a school teacher for 2 decades now. She went to Miami University in Southern Ohio, majored in elementary education, and she just loves kids. She tells me all the time she can't wait to have grandkids. I said, well, let's find godly husbands for our daughters first. And so, I don't want to go down that road. And as a school teacher, one of the things my wife utilizes a lot is Winnie the Pooh. How many of you guys are familiar with Winnie the Pooh? Just hopefully every one of you. Unless you're raised in like a really Baptist home, you might not have been familiar with Winnie the Pooh. But sorry, JD, I don't know.
We had a million.
Did you? Good, because no cards, no dancing, no alcohol, but you did have Winnie the Pooh. All right, there you go. So you did get Winnie the Pooh. There's two opposing characters in Winnie the Pooh that have always enamored me. The first one is Tigger. You guys remember who Tigger is? Yes. The wonderful thing about Tiggers are wonderful things. Their tops are bottom made out of springs. They're bouncy, 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 fun, 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 fun. The wonderful thing about Tiggers is that I'm the only one. Good. So Tigger is always what? He's always happy. Tigger's always happy. In fact, I once did a sermon, and my wife's brutal with me, and I asked her what she thought of my sermon. And again, being a school teacher, she said, well, it was kind of like Tigger without the bounce. I said, wow, that's not a compliment at all. And so that's Tigger, though. Tigger's always happy, always up. Tigger's that very, very excited person. Who's the opposite of Tigger and Winnie the Pooh? Anybody know? Eeyore. I actually love Eeyore. I have an Eeyore mug at home because, and Eeyore is this. Well, thanks for noticing. I'm glad someone did. That's Eeyore, right? And so here's what I notice among Christians who wait on God. When Christians wait on God, let me ask you, are they Tigger or are they Eeyore? Eeyore. They're always Eeyore. Every Christian I've ever met who has at least even embraced this idea of waiting on God is Eeyore. They're just down in the dumps, they're kind of sad, they're melancholy, they're slow, and though they're seen as godly, one of the things that I want to show you guys today from Esther and other scriptures is that this is the opposite perspective that God wants us to have on waiting on Him. In other words, though waiting on God is not an easy activity, the Bible does say it's necessary, and it's a lot more, quite frankly, Tigger-like than we might think. So, 3 things I want to share with you about waiting on God that might help you see that. 3 things that Esther teaches us on how we wait on God that I think will help you embrace this more than just being an Eeyore. First is that we need to learn to wait expectantly. I don't think this is in your outline, so if those of you take notes, you want to write these down. It's interesting, when you look closely at Esther chapters 5 and 6, which is where we're at right now, we're about halfway through the book, we find Esther, when you look closely at this text, waiting with a lot of anticipation and expectantly, which is the opposite of Eeyore. So look with me at some of the verses in this story. Look at verses 1 and 4 and 8 of Esther 5, and you'll see what I mean. First, look at verse 1. It says, "Now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms, and the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace." So pause there. This is where Esther's just about ready to try to get an audience with the king. If you guys remember, an audience that might get her killed, because if the king didn't want to see her, the penalty for seeing that megalomaniac back then without being asked was death, even if you were the wife. And we already know he banished one wife, so Esther wasn't exactly completely free. So Esther is standing in the court there. Interesting, the Hebrew word connotes the idea of waiting, and the author doesn't tell us how long. Isn't that interesting? It's an indefinite period of time, and she's hoping that the king will notice her. Now, what would you call that? I would call that expectantly waiting. You and I have all had that experience. If you're feeling really sick and you don't know why you're sick and you go to the waiting room at the doctor, you're probably waiting somewhat expectantly. Or better example is that if you remember the old days when men were not there when wives were giving birth to their children, and you were in the waiting room, you were waiting expectantly. I think that's the idea here. That we know that Esther here is waiting on God. She's going to give God lots of room, but she's waiting expectantly. Now hold on to that and look at verse 4. It says, "And Esther said, if it please the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for her." And again, she invites him to dinner. So she doesn't ask her request then, which is strange. Again, she expectantly waits from that request all the way to dinner for God to do something. And then look at verse 8. Again, she says, "If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and do my request, may the king and Haman come to a banquet which I prepared for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." So again, she's stalling. And we have to ask ourselves why. And we know it's God room, but please see, in the God room, smack dab in the center of that, she's waiting and waiting expectantly. See, here's what waiting expectantly is. Waiting expectantly is when you and I wait in such a way in which our eyes are on the horizon. Our eyes are focused on something ahead of us that we hope will happen. You might not even know what that is. See, I don't think Esther knew all that was going to happen, right? She was just leaving God lots of room. But our eyes are fixed anyways, not on ourselves, not on our circumstances, which is where they tend to usually want to be, but on the horizon where we're hoping God is going to enter in and do something. And I think waiting expectantly not only is a key aspect to waiting, but I think it changes the way that you and I tend to wait. And it takes us from being Eeyore to a little bit more like Tigger. I don't think waiting is designed to be a depressing, miserable, gloomy, dismal kind of experience. I think it's designed to be an anticipatory experience as we look and wait to what God might do. And again, we don't have time to go into this. This is for another study, but I got to tell you, you do a study on waiting on God, the Old Testament is replete with examples of people who mastered the art of waiting on God. and waiting with patience and expectation. Think about it. Abraham leaves his home and he waits on God for the promised land. Joseph waiting in jail to see how God would fulfill his call on his life. The entire nation of Israel waiting to be set free when they were in Egypt. Moses wandering, waiting in the desert for 40 years to get God to be done with his discipline. And then waiting for a king during the time of the judges, for God to lift up a king. And then waiting during the exile, as we're seeing here, for God to come through and bring them back to their land. And then obviously, what's the biggest waiting in all of the Old Testament? Waiting for Howard, say it with me, a Messiah. Yeah, you're Jewish. Waiting for a Messiah to come and you're what? A political Messiah. Oh, well, let's not get into that. But yeah, lots of waiting in the Old Testament. In fact, get this. This will kind of blow you away. The Old Testament is such a resource for what it means to wait on God that there's actually 6 Hebrew words in the Old Testament for waiting on God. Isn't that interesting? 6. They have 6 different words in the Hebrew to describe what it means to wait. One of the most popular, I want to teach you real quick right now, is the Hebrew word kavah. It's used about 50 times in the Old Testament, and it's an interesting word. It originally, you study the etymology of words. The word kavah was originally used to simply mean to bind together vines, to twist them together to make kind of a rope or a wreath or something like that. But then the word morphed into this idea of looking for and gathering vines, which would make sense because in order to have vines that twist together, you need to look for and gather the vines. And eventually this word meant to wait. Why? Because when you're looking for the right kind of vine, you have to find the right kind of vine, and that takes patience and waiting. And so again, and it even connotes this idea, Bible experts point out, of waiting expectantly. And picture a guy looking for the right kind of vines to string together. You're expecting and hoping as you're searching for it to find it. So that word means to look, to gather, collect, to expect, to wait. And so with this understanding, look at how this word is used. In Psalm 40, verses 1 and 3, it says, I waited patiently, expectantly, kavah, for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm. And he put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and will trust in the Lord. So you get the idea. The psalmist there is waiting. And again, don't miss, he doesn't even know what he's waiting for. He knows he wants God to come through and do something to get him out of the miry clay. But he's waiting for God to just do what only God can do. But I don't sense Eeyore here. I sense more of a Tigger. And then, if you're not convinced there, look at Isaiah 8, verse 17. Again, Isaiah went through really difficult times. And yet Isaiah says this. He says, I will wait, kavah, for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will even look eagerly for him. Again, talk about God being behind the scenes. I mean, imagine your church being so much under the discipline of God. I think sometimes God is tempted to do that to people's churches, that he's hiding his face from them. He hasn't abandoned them, just kind of turned his face away a bit. And now all of a sudden, you say, I love God so much. I want to see so much of God move that I'm going to wait eagerly for him. Waiting expectantly is one of the first things that you and I do when it comes to learning how to wait on God. And it means that it's not about your agenda, it's about his agenda. And at least as Esther found out, this was a key to keeping her faith going and growing during a time of waiting and leaving lots of God room. So I know I don't even need to say this, but I got to tell you, this is so relevant to our lives, it's not funny. I have 3 kids, 2 older daughters and a younger son. And part of my job in the last 5 years has been trying to help each one of them navigate a very difficult road that many of your kids have gone through. The difficult road is this. They reach a level of adulthood, usually sometime between, well, depending on the kid, 12 and 28. Somewhere between that, they reach some level of adulthood. My kids, it was around 18. And their goal, that without even knowing it, is to unhitch their wagon emotionally and spiritually and even somewhat relationally from mom and dad, and then hitch it to Jesus themselves. That's a really tall order for a kid, especially if you're a kid raised in a Christian home. I find that I never had to went through that because I had a late in life conversion, as you guys know. So I had to unhitch my wagon from Mick Jagger and hitch it to Jesus. And that wasn't all that hard when I was finally ready. But my kids have had to unhitch their wagon from their parents' faith to their faith. And that's a really, really tall order, I think. My oldest daughter did it. I mean, it was almost unfair. She did it so well it wasn't funny. She's the Sunday school kid, and she just unhitched it, hitched it right to Jesus, and said, Mom and Dad, I love you. Thank you for a wonderful upbringing. And we thought, this is going to be easy. No. My second daughter went through a really dark period where she struggled with a lot of her own issues, and we got into counseling. And there was one point, I think I've told you guys this story, there was one point where I sat in a parking lot here in Phoenix with her, and I just asked her, I said, well, where is God in all of this? And she looked at me and said, I don't even think I believe in him anymore. What do you do with that? With a kid who's, you raised to know Jesus, you prayed over their crib, and, she's an 18-year-old reprobate. What do you do with that? I patiently waited. I prayed. That's probably the only thing you can do. I loved her. I didn't push too hard. And now, 3-4 years later, she's walking with the Lord. She's doing great. She's got through that dark time. And so I thought, okay, 2 down, 1 to go. And now I'm right in the thick of it with the boy. And a boy who's really smart and studying physics and is really into science. And I think I've told you guys, when he went off to college a year and a half ago, my IQ dropped by 60. And now all of a sudden I'm the dope. And I'm right in the thick of that. And so what am I doing right now with him? My wife said, you got to what? Back off. She said, if you ask him one more time if he's going to church, one more time if he's going to a fellowship group, one more time about his Bible, she said, you're going to scare him away forever. Back off. What do you do when you back off? There's only 2 things I can do. Pray and wait. But I'm waiting expectantly. I wait with a vision in my mind of what it would look like now that I see my 2 daughters, what it's going to look like for my son, to develop a closer, intimate walk with Jesus Christ. See, some of you guys are right there right now with loved ones, or maybe it's with your job or with your own spiritual life. You're in a holding pattern. God, you're flying over the airport, and God has said you may not land, just circle the airport. So you're in that holding pattern waiting. He says, wait expectantly. It'll make the process much easier. Now, more quickly, 2 other things we learned. The second thing we need to do is wait actively. In other words, we need to learn in such a way that we don't sit around, again, like Eeyore, but we wait and keep focused and keep active in our faith. So again, look at how Esther did this. Again, this is tucked away in the text. Most people miss this, but it's there and it's clear. When Esther started this whole God room scenario, it says this. It says, now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. So focus on that phrase. I put it there in a, whatever color that is, 3rd day. And from the time that Esther formulated her well-laid plan, this plan to create God room, and from the time she implemented, it tells us there were 3 days that went by. Now, you guys should know this because I mentioned it a couple times, but anybody remember what Esther did during those 3 days? What did she do? She fasted. Exactly right. She fasted. Anybody know why she fasted? What's fasting about in the Bible? Why do you fast? To lose weight? Is that it? No, hopefully not. Why do you fast in the Old Testament?
To hear God.
To hear God. To underline prayers. The old Christian greats used to say it this way, that when you deprive the flesh, deprive the body of certain things and not give it attention and feed it, it does something to the soul to make it more attuned to the things of God. And if you've ever tried it, it's true. If you can do fasting without thinking about food and thinking about, all these things, but really just take that time to focus on God, it really does make your soul more sharp to the things of God. So interesting, Esther fasted during this time. Then it says in verses 16 to 17, the passage that immediately precedes that tells us that she fasted. I'm ahead of myself. And so she fasted. Now, it's interesting. We noted a couple of weeks ago that there are other things that we do during times of waiting on God, and that is that other parts of the Bible tell us that we read the Bible, we serve others with our gifts and passions, we worship God privately and corporately, we obey Him with our actions, we share Him with others. And so I have called this over the years, maybe I got this from Andrew Murray, actively waiting on God. In other words, here's the myth. Some people think waiting on God, they get the picture that, again, you're depressed, but then the second picture is you're not doing anything, right? Passivity. You're just waiting, kind of like waiting in line or wait. No, that's not it. When you're waiting on God, you're still active, you're still moving. It's not the cessation of activity, but get this, it's actually the increase of certain activities that do nothing but add teeth and grit, meaning and purpose to your waiting. So if you can see waiting like this, then it just might change the way that you and I wait. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we doing while we're waiting? Are we just sitting around, or are we reading the Word more, praying more? Are we serving others more? Are we sharing our faith more? Are we obeying more? I'm waiting on God for certain things in my life right now, guys, but I'm not standing still. I'm moving on as I wait. I'm doing plenty of things as I wait to keep my walk going and growing. So this is Psalm 37:34. Again, as I did a big study years ago on this idea of waiting on God, this is interesting. The psalmist says, wait for the Lord and what? Keep His way, and He will exalt you to inherit the land. So you wait for the Lord and obey Him. And then check out this verse, Psalm 130, verse 5. I wait for the Lord, my soul does wait. Now here it is. And in His word do I hope. So what's this guy doing? Reading the Bible as he waits. So the question is, what are you waiting on God for today? Is it something in your marriage? Is it something with your job? Is it a personal dragon, a besetting sin that keeps frustrating you? Is it a past hurt that needs healed? Is it a prayer that's gone unanswered? Is it a family member like I just shared that needs help? Is it your health? I mean, we're always waiting on God for something, and we need God room, so we wait actively. We wait with fasting and prayer and His Word and fellowship and obedience and sharing and service, because as we do, that only helps our waiting. And then there's a third thing that we do in waiting, and that is that we wait as best we can with joy. We wait with joy. Now this one's going to seem kind of weird to you guys, because again, this is the opposite of the Eeyore thing. It's like all of a sudden, you want to be Tigger, but you're waiting expectantly. You're waiting with a lot of anticipation. Now what is it? My mind's going. You're waiting for the Lord expectantly. You're waiting actively. And then you and I need to learn to wait joyfully. And again, that almost seems, because of the way we use the word wait today, as a contradiction of terms, doesn't it? I mean, it'd almost be like asking somebody to scream softly, or asking someone to struggle easily, to wait joyfully. But I don't think that this is the case, especially, now here's the key, especially if you realize that joy is a choice. That joy is a choice. I had to kind of search hard in Esther to find this, but I think it's there. And maybe I'm reaching here. Doc, you can tell me if I am or not, but I don't think so. In Esther 6, verses 10 and 11, it says this. It says, then the king said to Haman, I don't know if you guys remember the scene here. This is the scene where it's between the first and second dinner, and the king wanted to reward somebody who had saved him from an assassination attempt early on in the story, and that guy was who? Who saved Haman? Mordecai saved the king. And so he has this dream, and he wants us to honor that person, and it's Mordecai. So he says to Haman, how would we honor somebody that's served me really well? And Haman thinks it's him. And it's not. And Haman says, well, I'd put on your best robe and put him through town and treat him like royalty, And he says, okay, bring Mordecai. And all of a sudden now it's a mess, because, Haman's play. You can't kill all the Jews when he's honoring Mordecai. So here's what it says when he honors Mordecai. It says, then the king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything and all that you have said. So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man who the king desires to honor. Now here's a question I want you guys to wrestle with. Do you think Mordecai found any joy in this at all? I mean, in one sense, you would say yes. In another sense, you got to remember he's got the burden of the impending doom of 1 million Jews on his shoulders because he wouldn't bow. And because he didn't bow, because of one man's act of obedience, 1 million are about to suffer. And he doesn't know it's over yet. I mean, the king hasn't said that, even close to that. And Haman's still against him big time. In fact, Haman, if you remember at this point, had built the gallows to hang him on. And those gallows were 75 feet tall. So get a picture. He's going through Susa in these robes and the horse and being honored by the king, but the Jews are to be exterminated on a set day in the future. He's visioning a gallows there. So at the very least, there's a confliction of emotions here, wouldn't there be? But I believe in the midst of that, as they started to see God enter in, and again, this is where I might be reaching. I don't have any textual evidence for this. I just have evidence of what it means to be a human or a follower of Yahweh and now Jesus. I think that Mordecai chose some joy in that situation. I think he would have chosen hope and allow his spirit to be a bit kindled, at the very least going, I think God's up to something. I think God's doing something. There's another great verse tucked away in Isaiah. Again, Isaiah is a very depressing book. You ever read Isaiah? I mean, it's God's word, and one of these days I'll preach out of it. But it's a hard-hitting book with a lot of doom and gloom. And yet, in the midst of doom and gloom, kind of like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, there's glimmers of great joy and hope in the midst of it. And so, look at what Isaiah says in Isaiah 25:9. It says, "It will be said in that day, behold, this is our God for whom." Oh, isn't this interesting? We have waited, that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. Twice there he says we have waited. Twice there he says rejoice and then also be glad. So I think there's a link between waiting and being glad. One story and then we're done. And we'll go to time of questions. Years ago, I met a very, very good friend in my last church, and her and myself and her husband and my wife have become good friends. He was a surgeon in Cleveland for years. He's now retired. And she is a bit younger than him. It's his second wife. His first wife died. And she had just a terrible, terrible past. She was a school teacher, didn't get married till she was in her mid-30s. And the reason she would tell you is because she was raped when she was 11 years old. They were on a family vacation at a beach, and an 18-year-old man saw her walking alone on the beach, took her back to his camp, and repeatedly raped her. This was back in the 1950s, and at that time, culture was a bit different than it is now. She went and told her parents what had happened. They took her to the hospital. The hospital indeed said, yes, you were raped. And the parents made this decision. They said, well, we need to put this behind us. So let's never talk about it again. It's over. It's in the past. Let's never bring it up again. Let's just move beyond this. That's really hard for an 11-year-old girl to do. So she never did. They never talked about it again. She never brought it up again. But she went into adulthood hating men, having a lot of addictions, and making a mess of her life, even though she muddled through her career as a school teacher. And then she became a Christian. And when she became a Christian, it did not all change. I mean, for years as a Christian, she struggled with her own issues as well. But eventually, God started to unravel this, and she started to get help and healing and prayer and counseling. And she really unpacked a lot of what had happened in her life and became very much an overcomer. She got control of her addiction. She met Dan, her husband, and they processed a lot of this and got married, and they have an awesome marriage. And she wrote a book on it, actually. And the book is called, interestingly, it's called The Elephant in the Living Room, because it's that old analogy that there's an elephant in the room that nobody will acknowledge. And she says, for years, there was an elephant in my life, my rape, and nobody would say a word. And until I said there's an elephant here, it wasn't going to go away. And she's helped countless women through a ministry that she has in the Cleveland area and even across the nation. One day, she was in my church in Cleveland. One day, I saw her after worship, and she was crying. And I said to her, it was a moment in time, her name's Marlena, and I said, what's going on? She said, it's just a rough day. She said, the dragons are nipping at my heels again. And I knew what that meant. You never get completely over that. She said, just a rough day. She's crying. And then she said this to me. She said, but I choose joy. I choose joy. and a smile came on her face. And if I didn't know better, I thought she just might be faking it till she makes it, because a lot of Christians tend to do that. But I got to tell you, man, it felt so real. And I talked to her about that since then. I said, how often do you choose joy? And you know what she said to me? Every day. She said, every day. She said, if I allowed it, I could be overwhelmed by those emotions. I could be overwhelmed by all this stuff. She goes, Jesus had taught me to choose joy every moment of every day. She doesn't always take away everything, but it takes the edge off. See, I think that you and I can choose joy a lot more than we do. Some of us think don't have any control of our emotions because our anger is out of control, our sadness is out of control. And I'm not saying that you can completely control emotions. I had a therapist once say to me, this was the best. He said, emotions are kind of like a pinball machine. The ball's going in there, and you can't exactly control where the ball's going to go, but you do have flippers. And he said, and you can nudge the machine without tilting it. He said, you can nudge emotions in a certain direction. That was a good analogy for me. I think that's right. I don't think we can directly control our emotions. I can't make myself feel anything, but I can nudge them. If I couldn't, I'd be a mess. I think you and I can choose joy a lot more than we do. I'm waiting on God right now for some key things in my life. I really am. And some of them, Dave and I have been talking about lately. So there's some things that actually have been robbing me of my joy. And that's why I said earlier today, last night, God was whacking me over the head, especially when I got to this third point of saying, you've been depriving yourself of a lot of joy, Jamie, because you think because of your circumstances you can't have joy. Where your joy is not found in your circumstances, your joy is found in me. See, and as a pastor, I even forget that sometimes. So what am I doing? I'm waiting on God. I'm leaving room for God to show up and do what he needs to do. And I'm doing so expectantly, I'm doing so actively, and today I'm doing so joyfully.